This is a stained glass panel of Nyx, the goddess of the night, from the video game Hades that I made. We posted this and got lots of questions about some of the techniques that I used, and I thought I'd make a little video kind of talking about some of these techniques in a little bit more detail. Obviously, quite a bit of this is painted. Well, first off, anything that you see that is a color is the color of the glass. I didn't paint with colors. The paint that I used is a black paint. It's what's called a vitreous paint, which is actually glass that has been ground down to a fine powder, and then you mix that glass with a liquid and use that as paint, and you paint that on the glass. So for example, here in her hair, I started by cutting the shape out of gray glass, mixing the vitreous paint, and then I did the line work, these dark lines and some of these darker shadings. Fired that in a kiln so that that vitreous paint melts and fuses with the glass, so it becomes a permanent part of the glass itself. And then take that out of the kiln, and once it cools down, I did another layer of paint, a very, very thin, light layer. Painted the whole thing and let it dry. And then what I did is I'm using a bamboo skewer. I use this to scratch away that dry paint so that I can create these highlights. And then that goes back in the kiln so that second layer of paint can fuse with the glass. And that's basically the shading technique that I used for most of these pieces. You can see here in the gold work, there's highlights here. After I did all the dark line work, I did those shading and highlights. You see it in the jewel. You see it in the ribbon. Pretty much all of the gold work. You can see where I use that to create these highlights, and it really gives depth and detail to the character. It's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time, but I think it really helps to sell the character. People also asked about making these stars. It actually wasn't too difficult. I cut this out of clear glass. So this is actually 2 pieces of clear glass. So I cut them to shape, paint the entire thing pitch black using that vitreous paint, fuse it in a kiln, and then once it cools, I used a rotary tool with a fine spinning tip, and I used that to just sort of tap and cut through the paint that I had just fused to reveal the clear glass behind the paint, so we could create this kind of interesting star field. I started, by the way, with a template, as you always do with stained glass. So this is just a print of the original character art, and I started by tracing in marker all of the lines and really defining where those separate pieces of glass are going to be. So for example, I had to decide that in her face, in order to accommodate this jewel, I had to separate her face into 2 pieces. So I decided with these little stars across her forehead that I would basically split here so that I could cut the triangle here and the semicircle here to accommodate the jewel. We can see that in the final piece. And that way, hopefully, this is kind of subtle, right? It kind of just looks like a headband with some stars in it. The other thing that was challenging about this character is taking into consideration a lot of these sort of spiky features that she has. There's these stars in her hair, there's hooks and points, and when you're working with glass, these sorts of pointy things are a challenge. Not only to cut and shape, but also to have this accommodate a background. So if I left this background as a single piece of glass, I would have to cut this shape into that glass. And glass really doesn't like having points like this cut into it. It creates a stress point, and what will happen is it will run a crack from the tip of this point to the edge of the glass. almost guaranteed with a shape like this. So I was really concerned about those stars in particular. So I had to try to find a way to kind of break up these points. And my solution was, well, she's the goddess of the night. What if she had a full moon behind her? And you can see now in the final piece, even though this wasn't part of the original character art, I've added this full moon, and you can see where it just catches the tips of these stars, so we can break up those points. So the points hit a solder line rather than going directly into a large piece of glass. And that kind of helps to relieve that stress and avoid fractures. And then we've also got things like, again, this hook down here and this crescent moon point. If I were to leave this background as a single piece of glass, not only would that be extremely difficult to cut, but it would almost certainly crack in places like this and here between these pieces. So I had to find a way to break this up. So my solution was to introduce these cloud bands. I thought, well, I've already got a moon here. What if there were bands of cloud in front of the moon? So I added this piece just to kind of communicate to the viewer that that's what this is. And then this second one down here is the functional piece. So we can see where the top of this cloud just catches that crescent moon tip that I was worried about, and the bottom of it catches that little hook from the bat wing. So I've taken some creative liberties with the character that I think are still fitting with the character. I think they're still true to her, but allow me to actually create that character and be accurate to her. Otherwise, I would have had to remove some of these points because it just wouldn't be possible without cracking the glass. The archway was just a design choice that doesn't really serve any structural purpose. I just really wanted something to kind of tie the character herself to the rectangular piece that she's in. If I just left this all glass, there's really not a whole lot going on. So it just kind of ties it all together, and I'm really happy with how that came out. And again, this is just like with the star field. Basically, I started with blue glass, painted it all black, let the paint dry, and then took my bamboo skewer and scratched away, created these vine shapes, almost like a wrought iron look. I was kind of inspired by some medieval stained glass art that I've seen. And again, I think they're true to the character. It complements the piece. I'm very happy with how those came out. So those are just some of the techniques that I used to make this character. The tools are basically just a glass cutter, a grinder, soldering, of course. A kiln has been essential for the paintwork, and a rotary tool has been absolutely essential. Some of these fine pieces with complex inside curves just wouldn't be possible on a standard grinder, so having a handheld rotary tool to help me cut out some of those finer pieces was really important. Well, I hope you've learned a thing or two from this video, and if you have any other questions about some of the techniques that I use to create my art, let me know.